I hope you're seeing me, whether you're on Instagram or Facebook. You just heard my cuckoo clock. I haven't reset it yet. Wondering if you have reset your clocks or if you'll just wait until spring. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to get on. Oh, my mom's here. Hi, Mom. Make sure you get your coloring page printed if you are going to join us in the color along, or maybe you just feel like listening tonight. Maybe coloring's not your thing. It's all good, however you want to do it. I'm excited that my mom's here. Mom, listen to the last story. There will be a moment that I think feels very familiar to you. Don't know if you have hot cocoa or tea, what you're drinking tonight, what you're using to settle in and be calm with. But I hope you are finding a way to relax and feel good. That is always my intention, that you always feel good when you hear my voice. That's what I hope for. Oh, good. Dad's here too. Okay, Facebook, I'm getting some information. They're saying my frame rate is too low. I don't know how to set the frame rate any higher. I hope I didn't just leave you. Are you still there? Oh, someone from Algonac. Hi. If you're from Algonac, I think you probably recognize a lot of things in the stories. I grew up spending a lot of time on Harson's Island, and that is definitely an inspiration for the cottage stories. I do want to know where you are. So if you're out there and you want to say really quick where you are, folks in Canada, folks in Alaska, all over the world. I know some people are already fast asleep. If you're in Europe listening and you heard ads in the last couple days in someone else's voice, please know that that is not done purposefully. Someone uses my content without my consent. It stinks for everybody, but you should never hear a voice that isn't mine on the podcast. So if you have heard that, my apologies. My team is working on it. It should be fixed very soon. I'm just going to take one moment to try to fix whatever Facebook is asking me to fix before we get started. Set the frame rate. Sure. Let's do that. Let's give this a quick Google. Sorry, don't mean to bump you. Don't know how to do any of that. So if anyone knows how to set the frame rate in Facebook and can tell me how to do it, I just looked it up. It looked like it was written in another language. My beautiful glasses will be on my face in a second. They're super reflective. Hi, Petra. I'm glad you made it all the way from Melbourne. Portia is asleep in bed. What a surprise. Okay, Facebook, they keep telling me something's wrong. I don't know how to fix it. Hopefully, they'll let me just carry on. All right, guys. It's time to settle in. Before we take our really deep breaths, I've been doing this really simple breath. It's very useful, especially right after you eat and you want to help yourself digest, or anytime that you just want to bring your nervous system down a bit. So rather than filling all the way up to the top of your chest, I'm a yoga teacher, so I can't help explaining this a little bit, but you often think about breathing low lungs, mid lungs, up, upper lungs, and then emptying all the way out. I want you to aim for like 2/3 full, and then a real relaxed sigh. So it's kind of like, let's do 5. So 2/3 full. Even more relaxed. Nice. Now let's take our really big one. And out. One more time all the way in. Out with sound. Good. Okay, get out your crayons, your pencils, your markers, whatever you're using if you're doing that. And know that you don't necessarily need to look at me. You can just listen like you're used to doing. I'm going to read 3 stories tonight. I'm going to read At the Bakery, and then Back to the Bakery. And then I'm going to read a story that hasn't come out yet. It's called First Frost. And it's actually the sequel to the first story I ever wrote, A Block from Home. So if that's a favorite of yours, stick around to the end, because I finally thought, what's that person in the house with the kitty falling asleep in their library? What are they up to? And I wrote a story about it. In the bakery. I stood inside the front window of the shop and looked up and down the street for a few moments. Morning light was cutting through the lines of the buildings, and a few of the storefront windows were lit up. The neon sign in the diner on the corner flickered and glowed steadily on. I knew our customers would start to arrive in a few minutes for their orders of bagels, pastries, and loaves of fresh sliced bread. I dusted off my floury fingers on my apron and flipped our sign from closed to open before unlocking the heavy oak door and stepping back behind the counter. Our cases were full of just baked muffins, rolls, and loaves. Our coffee was brewed, and I had a hot cup tucked behind the register. We were ready. Saturday mornings were my favorite at the bakery. During the week, customers rushed in and out, eager to get their breakfast and coffee and get to work. But on the weekends, all of us, bakers and customers alike, were more relaxed. People lingered over coffee, turned the pages of newspapers slowly, and took time to really enjoy the jelly donuts and wedges of coffee cake that we loved to make each day. The bell rang over the door, and I looked up to see the familiar face of a waitress from the diner, her spring coat pulled over her apron, hands ready to receive the tray of goods we had wrapped up and ready. In a hurry? I asked. No, it's Saturday, she said with a wave of her hand. We've only got a couple of regulars, and they pour their own coffee anyway. I think this might be a very Midwestern detail of pouring your own coffee in a diner. I don't know, maybe wherever you are, if you go often enough and you need a heat up on your coffee, do you just get up and pour it yourself? Because those are the kind of diners I grew up in. We smiled. "Well, try this then." I passed her over a slice of still warm biscotti in a waxed paper wrap. "I'm trying new recipes, and I need an opinion I can trust." She took it gratefully, and I poured her a quick cup of coffee to go with it. "It's orange and pistachio, and you might want to dunk it," I said, sliding the cup across the counter. "I don't trust people who don't dunk," she observed. "This is why I'm asking your opinion," I said, tapping my finger to my nose. She held the slice up close to her nose and breathed in the cookie's scent. She looked it all over, and I saw her taking in the ratio of pistachio pieces to ribbons of orange zest. Sometimes when I hand someone a sample and ask them for feedback, they gobble it down in 2 bites, say, "It's great," and move on, which is nice to hear, but it's not very helpful. This woman knew what she was about. She had a bite without dunking first, chewed slowly, then thoughtfully dipped it in her coffee and took a second bite. She looked up at me, ran her tongue over her teeth, nodding slowly. "I think the orange should be a little bit stronger, but the bake is right on. It's crispy and a pleasure to dunk, but if you want to eat it as it is, it's not going to break your teeth." I'd say it's a winner. Pleased down to my clogs, as all bakers are when something they make is properly appreciated, I slid the coffee thermos back onto its warmer and went to fetch the order she'd come in for. I handed it over to her. She thanked me for the treat, and we said, "See you tomorrow," and she headed back to her customers. For the next few hours, there was a steady stream of patrons. Some were regulars, whose orders we knew by heart, and some were new faces who stood staring at the cases, biting their lips and asking for recommendations. We brewed pots and pots of coffee, packed dozens of donuts into paper boxes tied with string, handed over plate after plate of muffins and scones and toasted bagels. We handed out soft, salty pretzels wrapped in waxed paper, boxes of dinner rolls and focaccia slid across the counter into eager hands. We sliced loaves and wrapped them up for afternoon sandwiches. Pies were deliberated over and finally selected the names. Pies were deliberated over and finally selected. I did write this. It's been a minute though. And finally selected, and names were applied onto birthday cakes. We wiped crumbs from the counter and tables and started to deliver the sad news that this or that had sold out for the day. As the day moved on and the bell rang less and less, I pulled out a few of my favorite cookbooks from the shelf in the office and poured a fresh cup of coffee. I set myself up at the counter where the sun was shining and flipped through the book that was older than I was, with pages stained and creased and filled with handwritten notes. It was a gift from the baker who'd first opened this shop I'd bought the shop when he retired. He was a kind man with a quiet voice and flour in his eyebrows. I remembered coming in for my daily bread and one day taking a bite of something and saying to him that I could always tell his bakes from any others, that he seemed to have a sort of signature flavor. He'd smiled, leaned his elbows on the counter, and turning his head side to side to make sure his secret wouldn't be heard by anyone else, whispered, "Graham flour." We'd been friends from that day, and I came to work for him soon after. Looking through his book of recipes made my stomach grumble, and I stepped behind the counter and took a baguette from the shelf. I sliced off a good long bit and slid it open. I had a bottle of olive oil, green and fruity, the kind that catches you in the back of the throat, and I drizzled it over the bread. In the fridge, I found a stash of artichoke hearts and a jar of capers, and in the pantry, a container of soft, sun-dried tomatoes. I layered them all over the oiled bread, cracked black pepper on top, and took my plate back to the sunny spot at the counter. My bread was delicious, and I proudly enjoyed every bite as I flipped through more biscotti recipes. I took the pen from my pocket and added a note. More orange flavor? Maybe add marmalade? My next plan was for hazelnut and chocolate biscotti, and something for spring, strawberry and rhubarb. I carried my cup back to the window where I'd stood that morning before flipping the sign. I looked up and down the street. Saturdays were my favorite. That one's in the book. I think I knew when I wrote that it was going to be a fan favorite. It felt like a different kind of story than I had written before. And being able to really explore the village of Nothing Much and build on the relationships and the characters there has been probably the most fun part. Now that we're getting further on, we're going to be in our 9th season soon. So even just hearing marmalade made me smile, thinking that maybe it was a seed planted early. People ask me a lot if we're going to hear more about marmalade and now Crumb. Absolutely you will, probably one story per season. I really kind of feel like it should be a Disney movie or a show. I feel like they could have their own show. Okay, keep coloring, friends. We're going to go back to the bakery. So this is a summer story. That was an end of winter, almost spring story. Now we're going into summer. And then our last story, First Frost, which hasn't come out yet, is sort of a transitional story between autumn and winter. Back to the bakery. In the kitchen, behind the wall of bread baskets, where we slot fresh baguettes and ciabattas and pyramids of rolls into place each morning, there is a long, flowery workbench and a row of deep ovens that start heating before the village is awake. There is a long row of aprons on hooks, open shelves with dozens of mixing bowls, tall pitchers full of every kind and shape of spatula and mixing spoon and dusting wand, and a broad, cool slab of marble to roll pastries on. Over the years, I'd learned how to time the proving and chilling so that a lot of prep happens in the afternoons, and less while I am still rubbing the sleep from my eyes at the crack of dawn. Still, I am an early riser, either by nature, perhaps I was a baker down deep in my genes, or at this point purely from habit. And I never mind unlocking the door while most of the village slept. Today had been no different. A cool, quiet morning as I'd walked through the back alley just before dawn. I recognized the kitty with the crooked tail, who was often stretched out in the front window of the tea shop, sitting now on a crate behind the bookstore. I think he got his breakfast there most days. And though I called out in a low voice to him, he didn't stop his morning ablutions to so much as look at me. I laughed, thinking of that old Nan Porter line, that if cats could talk, they wouldn't. I found my key on the ring and jiggled it into the old lock until it turned, and I stepped into the kitchen. I had a routine. Coffee first. Luckily, the me from the day before had been looking out for the me of this morning. So the drip machine was ready, fresh grounds in the basket, and the reservoir filled with water, waiting to become something even more vital. I pushed the button and tied on my apron. I went hunting for my favorite cup while it perked companionably on the counter. When my cup was full, I pulled up on a stool by the register with a pad of paper and a sturdy black marker to make my morning punch list. It was a Friday. I was nearly sure, and I pulled my calendar closer to confirm. Yes, Friday. So we'd need plenty of bagels and muffins for the breakfast crowd as they bustled in before work. I had trays of bagels in the fridge, formed and risen, ready to be pulled out, and when they'd reached room temperature, briefly poached before being slid into the oven. I'd make some with sesame seeds, some with a crust of crunchy salt, and some with swirls of cinnamon and raisin baked inside. The muffins I could mix with my eyes closed. The fresh strawberries had run out the week before, but now we had blueberries from a farm outside of town. And I thought they'd go perfectly with the candied yuzu zest and ginger syrup I had in the pantry. I always made a tray of lemon poppy seed. They were classics and the go-to for lots of morning regulars. In a few more weeks, the cases of zucchini would start showing up, and I'd be making loaves and muffin tins full of the sweet, dense bread that they lent themselves to so well. I'd check my shelves for the dark chocolate chunks I like to fold in with the grated zucchini. Along with the fruit itself would come a few precious boxes of the flowers, which we'd dip in batter and fry off, wrapping them in wax paper and handing them out for afternoon snacks. I'd gotten distracted thinking of zucchini. Happens to me a lot. I tapped my marker on the pad, What came after muffins? Bread. Always bread. Sourdough and pumpernickel and soft, sweet wheat. Baguettes and ciabatta that made good toasted sandwiches, and the rolls people bought to go with their salads at lunch. And a good lot of pastries as well. Some filled with jam and others with warm chocolate. When I'd taken over this place from the previous owner, a man whose baking had inspired me for years, he'd encouraged me to push our customers toward new flavors and textures. He told me that when he started, no one wanted anything other than white bread, birthday cakes, and a chess pie on Sunday. It took time, he said, but soon his rye and pumpernickel were bestsellers. His pretzels and sesame cookies became parts of traditions for lots of people in the village. No one even contemplated getting through New Year's without a box of his flaky cardamom buns. And it had been the same for me and the pastries. No one bought any for the first month. They didn't know how to eat them, when, and with what. But slowly I found myself wrapping more and more in bakery paper, handing them across the counter to watch customers take immediate bites, not wanting to waste a moment of their still warm, flaky deliciousness. And nowadays they were always sold out by 10 a.m. I just started to sneak pistachio into the mix, and we'd see how that went. I stood up and refilled my coffee and went into the kitchen. I washed my hands and started pulling trays out of the fridge and heating the ovens. There was an ancient radio, old enough to have a tape deck in it, but still working, propped up on the shelf over the sink. And I reached up on tiptoes to twist the knob. When I was younger, this station had played the newest music that came out on the tapes that would probably still work in the deck. The kind that every now and then had to be rewound into their cases with a carefully angled pencil. But as the years went by, the playlists had stayed the same. Now, I guessed these were oldies, but I didn't mind. I liked knowing the words, the drum beats, and the spots where the bridge flowed into the chorus. Soon the bagels were coming out, the muffins and bread loaves going in. I was a few minutes away from flipping the sign on the front door, and my morning helpers would be here in a minute, tying on their aprons and pouring their own cups of coffee to keep close to their stations. Each morning we filled a few orders for local cafes and diners, and I set about laying out their trays. I had scraps of paper tucked up on the board above my station with each spot's order, though they rarely changed, and I knew them by heart. As I set out the sliced sandwich bread and bagels, my first assistant of the morning appeared behind me with a tray of hot donuts. Time always got away from me in the mornings. I blessed my staff for paying attention to the clock and added the donuts to the tray. I was about to wrap up the last order, the one for the diner, kitty corner from our own front door, when I remembered something special I'd made the night before. I often slipped a little treat into this order. The waitress who came to fetch it each morning was a friend and the best taste tester we had. It had been a week of hot, sunny days, and I'd had tiramisu on my mind, served chilled with plenty of espresso-soaked ladyfingers and a dusting of cocoa powder on top. It was the perfect summer boost. In fact, its name meant pick me up. I took a tray of it from the freezer and used my sharp chef's knife to cut out a perfect square. It was frozen hard, so the layers showed perfectly along the sides, and I knew a moment of baker's pride as I slid the square into a paper container, which I folded closed, and took out my marker to write across the top. Let sit for 10 minutes, and then have the perfect summer breakfast. A dash and a scribbled heart, and I popped it on the tray with the rest. I heard the bell over the door ring. Another day at the bakery had begun. I love that story too. I love revisiting the baker. The second Nothing Much Happens book, which I have promised my agent would be done by Thanksgiving, and probably will, dives a lot deeper into some of these characters. You really get to meet the first baker, the man with the flower in his eyebrows. You get to see where he lives. You get to learn about how he makes those cardamom buns. And you get to meet the woman who owns the bookshop. You get to meet some really interesting characters and dig deep and enjoy what I think of as like truly conflict-free writing. It's, you know how this works, deeply detail-orientated. It's about mood and observing the ordinary magic around us. And I wanted to get that even more fleshed out than it was in the first book. So I have maybe about a month's work left on it, but I'm very excited about it. You'll be hearing more as soon as I have more to tell you. How's the coloring going? I hope you're having fun. I've got one more story. No Bob here to edit my throat clearing out. So the first story I ever wrote for Nothing Much Happens is A Block from Home, which is episode 1. And it was really based on a story I told myself that I've been telling myself for years. And it's something that I often recommend to people when they think about how do they tell their own story without feeling stressed out about it. Let's say you wake up in the middle of the night and you're not sure how to use narrative, storytelling to go back to sleep. Maybe there's a house that you lived in, and when you lived there, you felt safe, you felt good. And you can remember the layout of the house. Maybe it's the house you live in now. Maybe the house you live in now has a lot of unfolded laundry in it. And it's not that relaxing to think about. It's okay, pick a different house. And you start just by walking up the front walk or the steps to the apartment of that place. And you just walk yourself through the rooms of the house. You lock the door, you turn the locks, you pull the curtain, and you go deeper and deeper into the house in your mind. And you fall asleep. That's a technique I've used for ages, and it became more and more a story. And was sort of the basis of me thinking I might be able to share this technique with other people. So it's something to try. The next time you find yourself awake in the middle of the night, it's the same as when I tell you, think back through the details of the story. Think through the details of a house, someplace you feel safe. Maybe it's a dream house, one you've never been in. That's okay too. It's your brain, my friends. You can do whatever you like in there. So this is sort of the sequel to that story. That story ends with the person tucked up inside their house, all the locks locked, and now they're going to go out, back into the world. First frost. It could have been any day this week. The temperature at night had been dropping closer and closer to it, and some of my neighbors had been pulling their pots of mums and decorative cabbages in from the stoop at night, hoping to make them last just a little longer. I thought about doing the same, but at some point the frost would come, right? At some point we'd have to let our autumn plants go and welcome the creeping lines of ice to our window panes and cabbage leaves. And this morning, as I drew back the heavy curtain from the front window, I saw that it had come. I looked closely at the window itself, the icy pattern curving at the corners of each pane. It looked like tiny ferns that had unfurled from frozen fiddleheads while I was sleeping. It is interesting how nature repeats herself. The plants in my window box now replaced with these frosty counterparts. I looked out at the yard, blades of grass tipped with white and stiff with cold, and the gate at the end of the front walk, looking as though it had been draped with stringy cobwebs. As I watched, a bundled newspaper came sailing skillfully over it and thumped against my front door. I waved a friendly hand from the window at whoever had delivered it, but as I couldn't see them, I doubted they could see me. I stepped over to the door to retrieve the paper, first twisting the deadbolt, then sliding the chain and unfastening the latch. My silly row of door locks, which only existed because I very much like the feeling of closing out the rest of the world when I get home at night. Now, as the sun was rising higher, bright beams bouncing off my frosted window, I was happy to welcome it back in. I squatted down on the stoop and unrolled the paper. I'd noticed it getting thicker in the last few weeks as notices for holiday events and sales began to fill it out. I stood with it in my arms and looked out at the street for a few moments, letting the chill shiver up my spine and taking deep breaths of the wonderfully fresh, cold air. I thought I might take a look at the paper first, then bundle up and walk through town. Sometimes, not very often, but every once in a while, the frost will meet with warming air as the sun comes up, and a kind of cold fog will rise and catch in the branches of trees. I thought it might be one of those days, and I was eager to walk the park and see what I could. I closed the door behind me and shuffled in my slippers through to the kitchen. I laid the paper on the table and pulled up a chair. The weather was predicted to be warm. The weather was predicted to warm a bit as the day went on, which boded well for my outing. I don't know why I'm trying to read without my glasses on. What am I trying to prove? There was going to be a winter greenery market in the park in early December, and I made a mental note of the dates. I wonder if we'll hear more about that later. Skimming the classifieds, I saw an ad I'd read a few times before about a ring that had been lost somewhere downtown between the movie theater and the stationery shop. I frowned down at the 2-inch high article. I didn't know who had posted it, who had been looking for that ring, but I hoped it would be found. I read the description again. Yellow gold, an emerald, a few small diamonds, a family heirloom. I refolded the paper and stacked it neatly on the table and went to get my coat. I stopped to look into the small room at the back of the house, whose floor-to-ceiling bookshelves were stuffed with novels and snow globes and picture frames. On her bed on the window seat, my old gray kitty was curled up and watching the birds at their feeder in the backyard. I rested my hand on her side and whispered that her bowl was full and that I'd be back in a bit. I could feel the thrum of her purr through her soft fur. She flicked her tail once, and I leaned down to kiss her forehead. She allowed it and turned her green eyes back to the windows. I pulled on my coat and hat and stepped back out the front door, pulling it tightly behind me. It wasn't bitter out, but it was cold, and I was glad to find gloves in my pockets. I went through my gate and turned on the sidewalk toward home. The frost was thick, coating fence rails and mailboxes and planters. At the green grocer on the corner, I stopped to look at the bins of delicata squash and long stalks of Brussels sprouts that were set out. In a bushel barrel propped by the door were large pine cones, scented with cinnamon, heaped into a pyramid. Across the street at the diner, the booths were full, and I could see a waitress setting down a tall stack of pancakes in front of a smiling customer. I walked further, feeling my body warming up with the exercise. At the entrance to the park, I stopped at the kiosk and bought a coffee. The man inside was well wrapped in a long scarf, and as we chatted, he poured my cup and pointed to the small heater going at his feet. "First morning I needed it," he said, handing the coffee over to me. We told each other to stay warm, which is as common a greeting as good morning around here in the wintertime, and I walked into the park. The sun was reflecting on the pond, which was still full of a paddling of ducks. Most were out on the water, unbothered by the temperature, their bright orange feet pushing them around from one edge of the small lake to the other. There were a few other people walking the paths. Almost no one was stopping to sit on a bench today. Better to keep your blood pumping. Past the lake, there is a broad open meadow with just a few trees scattered around. And sure enough, they looked like they were draped with clouds. Thick, cold fog clung to their branches. I sipped my coffee. It was strong and almost bitter and delicious. I walked closer to one of the trees. I wanted to see up close what it would look like, if, as usually happens, it would seem to disappear as I neared. The grass around it was still white with frost and sparkling in the sun. When I stepped to the base of the tree, I looked down rather than up as my shadow blocked the sun, and saw among the white blades of grass a glint of green. I wouldn't have seen it if the frost had not painted the landscape with ice. I squatted down and brushed aside a few frost-covered leaves, capping what seemed to be a squirrel's hidey hole. Yellow gold, an emerald, a few small diamonds, a family heirloom. My smile was sudden and huge across my face as I reached down and dug out the ring. I even forgot to look up and learn the secret of the fog as I carefully pocketed the precious thing on my way home to answer a classified ad. Sweet dreams. Thank you, my friends, for being here, for coloring along. I hope you enjoyed it. I have a few minutes for questions. Why don't we I'll do a question from Instagram and a question from Facebook if anybody has anything they want to know. If you're ready for night-night, just turn me off. Snuggle up and go to sleep. That's that last bit about the ring. That's a detail from my mom's life. She was the loser and the finder in that moment, though, where she lost a ring and found it. It had been smashed flat, but she just turned it into a brooch. And that had just always stuck with me. And I thought it would be an interesting thing to insert into a story. And if you are a Premium Plus member, then you have already heard about this ring because it was in a bonus story. Was I a baker? I was a baker. I love to bake. I don't bake as much as I used to, but I'm a big fan of British Bake Off. I really enjoy it. I find it to be really relaxing, but I'm not that good at it. Somebody was asking me about having more recipes. The book does have recipes in it, and I learned as I wrote them that writing recipes is approximately 1,000 times harder than writing fiction. So I don't know how many more I will write. They are really, really difficult. People who are good at that are really amazing. Do I have a favorite season for my stories? I think probably fall is my favorite. It's just the coziest season for me. I am an autumn lover down deep in my soul. But I really love writing through the year. I often think I don't have anything to say about today, and I sit down and sometimes I even have a plan for where I think, okay, well, maybe you don't know where you're going, but start with this title. In fact, the story that comes out tonight at midnight is called Autumn at the Cabin. It's one of the Cabin in the Woods stories. But at first it was called First Frost at the Cabin. And I started just with the title to try to get the wheel spinning. And then I wrote the whole story. It just came right out of me. And I read it and there was no frost in it. And I was like, okay. Which was good. It gave me, I thought, all right, somebody else gets to tell about First Frost. I do not listen to my own podcast to fall asleep. That puts me in my head about it. I am too much the creator in that moment. How many pets do I have? I have 3. I have 2 Chihuahuas, Tiny and Ladybug, and a long-haired dachshund named Portia. Those are the names they all came with. They're all rescues, and they're just sweet lovers. They want to lay on top of me. All the dogs sleep on top of me every night. I just have this effect on everyone. If you get too close to me, watch out. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's time for me to tuck myself into bed. This video will be up so you could listen again if you want to color something else or just play it at any time. It'll stay right where it is. So thank you so much. I will do more lives coming up. I was actually thinking about maybe doing a live loving kindness meditation, just kind of feeling like maybe that was something people would need. So keep an eye out for that. I will keep letting you know. Sweet dreams, everyone.